Chapter 1, Parts 4 through 6 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leon Meyer. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 1, Part 4. The Achaeans and the Trojan War. It is uncertain at what time the Achaeans made their first appearance in the Greek peninsula. They were a people of blonde complexion, of Indo-European speech, who came down from the regions of the Danube and made conquests in Thessaly and the plain of the Spercheius. In the course of time, some of their chieftains won lordships in the Peloponnesus, in Argolis and Laconia, probably by marriages with daughters of the old Greek dynasties. It is not probable that the Achaean invaders came in great numbers. They formed a small ruling class who were soon assimilated in speech and manners to their Greek subjects. They did not work destruction. They won lordship and leadership, and their adventurous spirit guided Greece to great enterprises. They carried on the traditions of the civilization which they found. In Thessaly, poor and backward; in the Peloponnesus, wealthy and luxurious. In the later remains of Mycenaean civilization, their presence or influence can be recognized by some new features which they brought with them from the north, such as the use of long swords, round shields, and brooches. They also introduced the practice of burning the dead. Some think it was these northern invaders who destroyed the palaces of Knossos and Phaestus. In that case we must suppose that before B.C. 1400 they had settled in Thessaly. But we can only be certain that by the 13th century they had both risen to power in Argos and made settlements in Crete. The dynasty from which the Homeric kings, Agamemnon and Menelaus, sprang was founded, according to Greek tradition, early in the 13th century by Pelops, a Phrygian. Agamemnon and Menelaus represent the Achaean stock, and the meaning of this Phrygian relationship is not clear. At whatever time they came, the Achaeans had become true Greeks, and were the most prominent among Greek rulers in the 13th and 12th centuries, and the kings who held sway in Argolis were the most powerful. It is significant that the minstrels of the 12th century used both Achaeans and Argives to designate all the Greeks. They used also, in the same sense, the obscure name Danaoi, which legend associated especially with the Argolid, and which perhaps belonged to the original Greek inhabitants of that district. The Achaeans of northern Greece, of the land which was later to be Thessaly, seem to have been the great sea adventurers of the heroic age. With this country were connected the memories of early Greek exploration of the Euxine, in the legend of the ship Argo. And to the Achaeans of Thessaly we must probably refer the earliest notice which preserves the Achaean name in a historical document. An Egyptian writing tells us that they came in company with other peoples from the lands of the sea, and invaded Egypt in the year 1229 B.C., when Merneptah was king. But the great achievement which made the Achaeans illustrious was one in which southern and northern Greece combined, the expedition against Troy. The Achaean name is specially associated with the land of Phthia in southern Thessaly, and the country to the south, including the plain of the river Spercheius, as far as Mount Oeta. The Spercheius region has a particular interest as the original land of Hellas. Here dwelled the Hellenes, a small folk, who would one day give their name to all the Greeks. They were probably the old Greek population who had been subdued by the Achaean invaders. If we may judge from the ancient names of places which the Greeks preserved, it would seem that languages closely akin were at one time spoken on both sides of the Aegean and in the Isles. The coastmen and highlanders of western Asia Minor called their capes and hills and streams by names which resemble in root and formation names which we find on the coast and in the highlands of Greece, and in islands of the intermediate sea. But the strange thing is that the diffusion of the civilization which we have been examining stopped short at the margin of the Asiatic shore. It extended to Rhodes and to small islands north and south of Rhodes, but it did not, until the days of its decline, touch the opposite continent. The people who held the seaboard of Asia Minor, between the Troad in the north and Lycia in the south, were the Meonians, the Carians, and the Leleges. It is a fact of importance that these lands lay outside the Mycenaean world, notwithstanding the affinities of race which bound the inhabitants of those countries to the folks of the Aegean islands and Greece. South of Troy, which stood quite by itself, there are no palaces or fortresses of the Mycenaean age along the East Aegean coast, nor in the large islands of Lesbos, Chios, and Samos. The relics even of commerce with the western Aegean, though one would expect such commerce to have been brisk and constant, are few and rare. There was, therefore, an obstinate resistance on the part of the inhabitants of these regions to the reception of the Aegean civilization of the Bronze Age. The most probable explanation of this fact is that a great inland power exercised control over Asia Minor down to the coast and excluded foreign settlements. This power was the empire of the Hittites. The ruins of their capital have been found at Boghaz Köi in northwestern Cappadocia. Their kingdom seems to have been lasted from about 2000 to 800 B.C., and about the time of the fall of Knossos they extended their power southward by conquering North Syria, where they established a second capital at Carchemish. They had close political relations with Babylonia, as is shown by the clay tablets in two languages, Hittite and Babylonian, which have been excavated at Boghaz Köi. Their lordship extended in some form to the Troad and the western coast of Asia Minor. The conjecture may be hazarded that they were the people who destroyed the great brick fortress of Troy. Many of the influences which passed to and fro between the Aegean world and Mesopotamia may have been transmitted through the Hittites. Their southward expansion meant wars with the Egyptians, who also aspired to dominate Syria. In a battle which was fought at Kadesh in 1287 B.C. between the two rival powers, we find the Lycians and the Dardanians of the Troad fighting for their Hittite lords. But about this very time the Hittite power was declining, and northwestern Asia Minor, as far as the valley of the Sangarius, was wrested from their rule by swarms of new invaders from Europe. These were the Phrygians, to whose race the Dardanians belonged, and who were so closely akin to the Thracians that we may speak of the Phrygo-Thracian division of the Indo-European family. After the destruction of early Troy, centuries had passed, during which no attempt was made to restore its vanished splendor. 3 different settlements indeed succeeded one another on its site, but they were insignificant, villages rather than castles. We may account for this long interval by the jealous policy of the Hittite kings. At length, before the middle of the 13th century, one of the Phrygian leaders built a strong stone fortress on the hill of Troy. This too disappeared. Probably, as we shall see, it succumbed to an enemy, and then, not long afterwards, built by the same people, arose the great stronghold of Priam, the Troy of legend and history. The new Troy, through whose glory the name of the spot was to become a household word forever throughout all European lands, was built on the levelled ruins of the older towns. The circuit of the new city was far wider, and within a great wall of well-wrought stone the citadel rose terrace upon terrace to a highest point. On that commanding summit, as at Mycenae, we must presume that the king's palace stood. The houses, of which the foundations have been disclosed within the walls, have the same simple plan that we saw in the older brick city and in the palaces of Mycenae and Tiryns. The wall was pierced by 3 or 4 gates, the chief gate being on the southeast side, guarded by a flanking tower. The builders were more skilful than the masons of the ruder walls of the fortresses of Argolis, which belonged to an earlier age. To the Trojan realm were reckoned not only the men of the Trojan plain, but the Dardanians in the upper valley of the Scamander, among the hills of Ida, the country of the Homeric Aeneas, and to the east the inhabitants of the plains of the Granicus and the Aesopus. And south of Mount Ida were a number of strongholds inhabited by Pelasgian tribes, who represented the original inhabitants of the country whom the Trojans had subdued. The lords of Troy, whether of the earlier fortress of brick or the later of stone, did not owe their power and wealth to the fertility of the soil or to any natural products of the region in which they had fixed their abode. The little plain, watered by the Scamander, has no advantages in itself to attract settlers, and its coasts, north and west, offer no good harbourage for ships. The fortune of Troy was due to the difficulties of navigation which beset mariners trading between the Aegean and the Euxine. The prevailing summer winds from north, northeast, and northwest used to detain sailing ships for days or weeks at the mouth of the Hellespont. The sailors wanted anchorage, and they wanted fresh water, which was to be got from the Scamander, and also on the west coast at Bashika Bay. These things the masters of the Scamander plain had it in their power to grant or withhold. Hence Troy was in a position to control the trade which passed through the Hellespont. And here a number of converging lines of traffic met. From Thrace and Paeonia came wine, swords, white horses, and perhaps gold. From Paphlagonia and the southern coast of the Euxine came timber, silver, vermilion, wild asses. Southward there was the commerce of the Meonians and Carians and Lycians. The Meonians, who were noted as slave dealers, dwelled in the land which was afterwards to be Lydia, on the banks of the Hermus and in the plain of Sardis. The Carians possessed Miletus, where there were skilful workers in ivory, and the districts of the Meander. The Lycians probably held much of the carrying trade from Egypt and Syria to northern Europe. The policy of Troy, which was, we may say, its very reason for existing, was to levy a toll upon all the traffic which converged on the Hellespontine shores. If there was, as has been supposed, a great yearly market in the Trojan plain, to which traders from all quarters came by sea or land with their merchandise, it was an arrangement which was not only profitable to the Trojan king who received the market dues, but may have been convenient to many of the merchants, sparing them longer journeys. Sacred Troy was thus a parasite which grew fat on the produce of others, and the Greeks, who desired to have access to the Euxine and to trade freely with all the world, determined to destroy it. We may conjecture that the fall of the fifth city in the course of the 13th century was the result of Achaean enterprise, and was the fact which suggested the legend of the sack of Troy by Heracles. This story is closely connected with the tale of the Argonauts, for Heracles embarked at Iolcus with the other heroes in the Argo, and left the ship during the voyage and destroyed Troy. It looks as if behind the whole legend there lurked the tradition of Greek attempts to navigate the Euxine between the fall of the fifth and the rise of the sixth city. So many legends of the heroic age of Greece have been proved by recent discoveries to have a historical basis, that there was nothing rash in supposing that here, too, imagination was not building in the void, but was working on the memory of definite events. It was probably at the beginning of the 12th century, as Greek tradition reckoned, that the Achaeans made ready a great expedition to exterminate the parasitic power which preyed upon the trade of the world. It is uncertain how far the Greek states of the time can be described as a federation or an empire, with a definite organization under the supremacy of Argos. But there seems no reason to doubt that the Achaean king of Argos, whose name in Greek tradition was Agamemnon, succeeded in enlisting the cooperation of the chief kings and princes of northern as well as southern Greece. It looks, indeed, as if the Achaean lords of Phthia and Thessaly, the country from which the Argo sailed, had a particular interest in the enterprise. All sailed to the plain of Troy. It was vain to hope that they could take by storm the well-walled castle of Priam. Their hope was to cut off all the trade on which Troy depended for her livelihood, and to starve her out. The tradition that the siege was long, 9 years according to the poets, is therefore in accordance with the conditions of the war. The Greeks supported themselves by raids on the surrounding subjects and allies of the Trojans. Priam's city fell. Her fall was the necessary prelude to the opening of the Propontis and the Euxine Sea to Greek commerce and colonization. When the Greeks, in later days, established themselves securely on the Hellespont and the Bosphorus, the hill of Troy ceased to have any value as a site, and though it was again inhabited, it was little more than a place of famous memories. Part V. The Homeric Poems. The later period of the heroic age, its manners of life, its material environment, its social organization, its political geography, are reflected in the Homeric poems. Although the poets who composed the Iliad and the Odyssey probably did not live before the 9th century, they derived their matter from older lays which must have belonged to the generations immediately succeeding the Trojan War. After the age of bronze had passed away, and the conditions of life and the political shape of the Greek world had been utterly changed, it would have been impossible for anyone, however imaginative, unless he were a scientific aquarian with an abundance of records at his command, to create a consistent picture of a vanished civilization. And the picture which Homer presents is a consistent picture, closely corresponding in its main features and in remarkable details to the evidence which has been recently recovered from the earth and described in the foregoing pages. The Homeric palace is built on the same general plan as the palaces that have been found at Mycenae and Tiryns, at Troy and in Boeotia. The equipment of the Homeric heroes and the man-screening Homeric shield receive their best illustration from Mycenaean gems and jars. The blue inlaid frieze in the vestibule of the hall of Tiryns proves that the poet's frieze of Cyanus in the hall of Alcinous was not a fancy, and he describes as the cup of Nestor a gold cup with doves perched on the handles, such as one which was found in a royal tomb at Mycenae. The subjects wrought on the shield which the mastersmith made for Achilles may be illustrated by works of art found at Mycenae and in Crete. The shield, wrought in bronze, tin, silver, and gold, is round and has a ringed space in the center, encompassed by 3 concentric girdles. In the middle is the earth, the sea, and the heaven, with the unwearied sun and the moon at her full, and all the stars wherewith heaven is crowned. The subject of the first circle is peace and war. Here are scenes in a city at peace, banquets, brides borne through the streets by torchlight to their new homes, the elders dealing out justice. There is another city besieged, and scenes of battle. The second circle shows scenes from country life at various seasons of the year, ploughing in spring, the ploughman drinking a draught of wine as he reaches the end of the black furrow, a king watching reapers reaping in his meadows, and the preparations for a harvest festival. A bright vintage scene, young men and maids bearing the sweet fruit in wicker baskets, and dancing, while a boy plays a lyre and sings the song of Linus. Herdsmen with their dogs, pursuing 2 lions, which had carried off an ox from the banks of a sounding river. A pasture and shepherds' huts in the mountain glen. The whole was girded by the third, outmost circle, through which the great might of the river Oceanus flowed, rounding off, as it were, the life of mortals by its girdling stream. The whole conception is due to the imagination of the poet, but similar scenes of peace and war were depicted by the artists of the Aegean, as for instance on the Cretan plaques, which probably adorn the cover of a chest of cypress wood, on which we saw a city represented, and on a vase of steatite, decorated by a picture of what is probably a harvest festival. The siege is illustrated by the scene of the leaguered city on the silver beaker, and dagger blades discovered at Mycenae show brilliant examples of the art of inlaying on metal. The art of writing, too, is mentioned in the Iliad, in the story of Bellerophon, who carries from Argos to Lycia deadly symbols in a folded tablet. The fact, which was doubted till a few years ago, that writing was practised in the heroic age, shows that the poet was guilty of no anachronism. There is, indeed, one striking difference in custom. The Mycenaean tombs reveal few traces of the habit of burning the dead, which the Homeric Greeks invariably practised, while, beyond what is implied in a single mention of embalming, the poems completely ignore the practice of burial. In later times both customs existed in Greece side by side. The explanation of this discrepancy seems to be that cremation was a practice introduced by the Achaeans. Hexameter verse must have already been far on its way to perfection in the 12th century, when the Greek bards used it to commemorate the Trojan War. The glorification of Achilles and other features of the Iliad point to northern Greece, where was the kingdom of Achilles and Phthia, as the home of one of these early minstrels. Southern Greece doubtless had its singers too, and here, we may suspect, the story of the homecoming of Odysseus took its first shape, marked, as it is, by a lively interest in the Peloponnesus and Crete. Part 6. Political and social organization of the early Greeks. The Homeric poems give us our earliest glimpse of the working of those political institutions which were the common heritage of most of the children, whether children by adoption or by birth, of the Aryan stock, of Greek, Roman, and German alike. They show us the king at the head. But he does not govern wholly of his own will. He is guided by a council of the chief men of the community whom he consults, and the decisions of the council and king, deliberating together, are brought before the assembly of the whole people. Out of these three elements, king, council, and assembly, the constitutions of Europe have grown. Here are the germs of all the various forms of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But in the most ancient times this political organization was weak and loose. The true power in primitive society was the family. When we first meet the Greeks, they lived together in family communities. Their villages are habitations of a genos, that is, of a clan, or family in a wide sense, all the members being descended from a common ancestor and bound together by the tie of blood. Originally the chief of the family had the power of life and death over all who belonged to the family, and it was only as the authority of the state grew and asserted itself against the comparative independence of the family that this power gradually passed away. But the village communities are not, as they were in the Asian foreworld, isolated and independent. They are part of a larger community which is called the phyle, or tribe. The tribe is the whole people of the kingdom, in the kingdom's simplest form, and the territory which the tribe inhabited was called its deme. When a king became powerful and won sway over the demes of neighboring kings, a community consisting of more than one tribe would arise, and while each tribe had to merge its separate political institutions in the common institutions of the whole state, it would retain its separate identity within the larger union. It was usual for several families to group themselves together into a society called a phratria, or brotherhood, which had certain common religious usages. The organization of clan and tribe, with the intermediate union of the phratry, was a framework derived from the Aryan forefathers, shared at least by other Aryan races. For we find the same institutions among the Romans and among the Germans. The clan is the foundation of Roman society, and the Julian gens, for instance, has exactly the same social significance as the genos of the Achaemenids of Attica. The phyle is the Roman tribe, and the phratry corresponds to the Roman curia, and to our own English hundred. The importance of the brotherhood is illustrated by Homer's description of an outcast, as one who has no brothers and no hearth. The importance of the family is most vividly shown in the manner in which the Greeks possessed the lands which they conquered. The soil did not become the private property of individual freemen, nor yet the public property of the whole community. The king of the tribe or tribes marked out the whole territory into parcels, according to the number of families in the community, and the families cast lot for the estates. Each family then possessed its own estate. The head of the family administered it, but had no power of alienating it. The land belonged to the whole kin, but not to any particular member. The right of property in land seems to have been based, not on the right of conquest, but on a religious sentiment. Each family buried their dead within their own domain, and it was held that the dead possessed forever and ever the soil where they lay, and that the land round a sepulchre belonged rightfully to their living kinsfolk, one of whose highest duties was to protect and tend the tombs of their fathers. The king was at once the chief priest, the chief judge, and the supreme warlord of the tribe. He exercised a general control over religious ceremonies, except in cases where there were special priesthoods. He pronounced judgment, and dealt out justice to those who came to his judgment seat to have their wrongs righted. And he led forth the host to war. He belonged to a family which claimed descent from the gods themselves. His relation to his people was conceived as that of a protecting deity. He was revered as a god in the deme. The kingship passed from sire to son, but it is probable that personal fitness was recognized as a condition of the kingly office, and the people might refuse to accept a degenerate son who was unequal to the tasks that his father had fulfilled. The sceptred king had various privileges, the seat of honor at feasts, a large and choice share of booty taken in war, and of food offered at sacrifices. A special close of land was marked out and set apart for him as a royal domain, distinct from that which his family owned. The royal functions were vague enough, and a king had no power to enforce his will if it did not meet the approval of the heads of the people. He must always look for the consent and seek the opinion of the deliberative council of the elders. Strictly, perhaps, the members of the council ought to have been the heads of all the clans, and they would thus have represented the whole tribe, or all the tribes if there are more than one. But we must take it for granted, as an ultimate fact, which we have not the means of explaining, that certain families had come to hold a privileged position above the others, had, in fact, been marked out as noble, and claimed descent from Zeus, and the council was composed of this nobility. In the puissant authority of this council of elders lay the germ of future aristocracy. More important than either king or council for the future growth of Greece was the gathering of the people, out of which democracy was to spring. All the freemen of the tribe, all the freemen of the nation when more tribes had been united, met together not at stated times, but whenever the king summoned them, to hear and acclaim what he and his councillors proposed. To hear and acclaim, but not to debate or propose themselves. As yet the gathering of the folk for purposes of policy had not been differentiated from the gathering for the purpose of war. The host which the king led forth against the foe was the same as the folk which assented, by silence or applause, to the declarations of his will in the agora. The assembly was not yet distinguished as an institution from the army, and if Agamemnon summons his host to declare his resolutions in the plain of Troy, such a gathering is the agora in no figurative sense. It is no mere military assembly formed on the model of a political assembly. It is, in the fullest sense, the assembly of the people, the fellow institution of the Roman comitia, our own Gemote, derived all three from the same old Aryan gatherings. The king was surrounded by a body of companions, or retainers, who were attached to him by personal ties of service, and seem often to have abode in his palace. The companions are the same institution as the thanes of our English kings. And if kingship had held its ground in Greece, the companions might possibly, as in England, have developed into a new order of nobility, founded not on birth, but on the king's own choice for his service. Though the monarchy of this primitive form, as we find it reflected in the Homeric lays, generally passed away, it survived in a few outlying regions which lagged behind the rest of the Hellenic world in political development. Thus the Macedonian Greeks in the lower valley of the Axius retained a constitution of the old Homeric type till the latest times, the royal power continually growing. At the close of the tale of Greek conquest and expansion, which began on the Caister and ended on the Hyphasis, we shall come back by a strange revolution to the Homeric state. When all the diverse forms of the rule of the few and the rule of the many, which grew out of the primitive monarchy, have had their day, we shall see the Macedonian warrior, who is to complete the work that was begun by the Achaean conquerors of Troy, attended by his companions like Agamemnon or Achilles, and ruling his people like an Achaean king of men. The constitutional fabric of the Greek states was thus simple and loose in the days of Homer. Perhaps few large communities had come into Greece, but larger communities were constantly formed in the course of the conquest. In the later part of the royal period, a new movement is setting in which is to decide the future of Greek history. The city begins to emerge and take form and shape out of the loose aggregate of villages. The inhabitants of a plain or valley are induced to leave their scattered villages and make their dwellings side by side in one place, which would generally be under the shadow of the king's fortress. At first the motive would be to gain the protection afforded by joint habitation in unsettled times, just as we find in an earlier age villages grouped under the citadel of Mycenae. Sometimes the group of villages would be girt by a wall, sometimes the protection of the castle above would be deemed enough. The change from village to city life was general but not universal. Many communities continued to live in villages, and did not form cities till long afterwards. The movement was promoted by the kings, and it is probable that strong kings often brought it about by compulsion. But in promoting it they were unwittingly undermining the monarchical constitution, and paving the way for their own abolition. A city-state naturally tends to be a republic. In the heroic age, then, the state had not fully emerged from the society. No laws were enacted and maintained by the state. Those ordinances and usages which guided the individual man in his conduct, and which are necessary for the preservation of any society, were maintained by the sanction of religion. There were certain crimes which the gods punished, but it was for the family, not for the whole community, to deal with the shedder of blood. The justice which the king administered was really arbitration. A stranger had no right of protection, and might be slain in a foreign community, unless he was bound by the bond of guest friendship with a member of that community, and then he came under the protection of Zeus the hospitable. Wealth in these ages consisted of herds and flocks, for, though the Greeks were tillers of the soil, and had settled in a country which was already agricultural, the land was not rich enough to bestow wealth. The value of a suit of armor, for instance, or a slave, was expressed in oxen. Piracy was a common trade, as was inevitable in a period when there was no organized maritime power strong enough to put it down. So many practiced this means of livelihood that it bore no reproach, and when seamen landed on a strange strand, the natural question to ask them was, "Outlanders, whence come ye? Are ye robbers that rove the seas?" End of Chapter 1, Parts 4 through 6.